able to tune in. Yeah, so as Vita mentioned, I teach the felting workshop about every fall at Fleisher. And felting, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is basically the art of tangling up wool into something solid. So that can be into a three-dimensional sculptural object or a flat piece of fabric, so to speak. And there's two basic ways of doing that. There's needle felting and then wet felting. I'm gonna do a sort of brief run through of each of them, starting with needle felting, which is more for sculpture. So I've got two video cameras here. So if you see it switching back and forth, that's why. So to start with needle felting, I want to just give you all a tour, so to speak, of the tools that you need for it. It's called needle felting because you use these very sharp needles that are generally about a finger length, depending on your fingers. They come in slightly different sizes, but what's special about them compared to just like your regular sewing needle, I'm not sure if you can see on the camera, but it has these tiny little barbs on the pointy part. So every time you stab it into your wool, it pushes the wool down and then also pulls some up from the center, and that starts to tangle it together. And then also for needle felting, you want to have a piece of some kind of foam. If you buy a needle felting kit from craft stores, online, wherever, it often comes with some sort of like, feels like sort of stiff mattress foam. I prefer this stuff, which is actually just insulation foam from the hardware store. I like the sort of resistance that it has. For all the materials and tools, if you have any questions about where to find them, you can always shoot me an email and I send you all the links. You can also get a holder for your needles and you can stick in, I think like 9 into it. I like generally 2 to 3. That just makes it go, 2 to 3 times faster. And then the most important thing is our wool roving. It's called roving when it comes in these long, pre-cleaned, pre-combed, sort of intestine-like pieces. You generally buy it by the pound if you're buying a sort of neutral color, which it's easiest to find white. You can also find black or gray. And then there is also, spotlight my other video here for a sec. There's also all these different colors. So in order to not have to dye our pieces with fabric dye afterwards, we just use pre-dyed roving. So it often comes in these little like 2-ounce packages or in rolls, and you can get more colors than at least I ever knew were available. So for needle felting, it's really a useful technique for making sort of sculptural objects. So I made this little owl dude here, kind of stands up on its own. Well, sometimes. And then I'm working on a collection of sort of like worry stones, rocks. And you can felt it to different densities. The more you stab it, the denser it gets. So squeezing this one as hard as I can barely compress the sides. This one's a little softer, so it's a lot squishier. This one even more so. So you can make, like stuffed animals, sculptures, etc. It is solid, so what I like to do in the interest of not using up a ton of my roving is actually have the center be made out of whatever cheap yarn I have on hand. So this stuff is at the center of all these little pieces here, and then I cover the outside in roving. So I have pieces at a couple different stages of the process, and I'll sort of take you through that bit by bit. So first, I'm going to compact a bunch of yarn to make the center. Once I get it compacted a bit, I'm going to put some roving over it. And the more you felt it, which you'll see in a minute, really just means stabbing it over and over with your needles, the denser it will get. So I like to give myself a head start and roll it up pretty densely, hold it tight, and unfortunately this isn't really the kind of craft that you can do while you're watching a movie, because you really have to watch your needles there, make sure you don't stab your finger. And this part is the reason that we need the foam underneath, so that you don't end up breaking your needle. If I were to do the felting just straight on my table here and stab all the way through, my needles would very likely break where the pointy part, sharp part ends right about here. If you're felting and that happens, these needles cost like 5 cents each, so it's really not a big deal, but you know, save the materials while you can. So as I'm felting this, the needles are all doing this work of pushing in the yarn from the outside of this blob. You can see those loose pieces are getting kind of incorporated in. So it's kind of tacking them down into the piece and then pulling up the yarn from the inside. And it's tangling it up, making it essentially into like a big yarn thread lock, so to speak. So I won't be able to untangle it because it's actually merging together all these different strands. And you can do this with most yarns. So for people who take my class, I recommend if you have a bunch of ugly scrap yarn you've been hoarding for a while because you think you might use it on something someday, but then you never actually have, this is the perfect use. You're never gonna see it because it's gonna be all covered in roving anyway. If you don't have yarn and you do happen to have a lot of roving, you can use roving for the center part, but in my experience, it just uses a lot of roving because you gotta get it really dense, and that stuff can get a little pricier, so go for the cheap inside. The reason I've settled on 2 to 3 needles in my holder here at a time is it's sort of a balance between efficiency and tiring out my hand and forearm. If I filled this up with all the 9 or 8 needles that it would hold, that would be so much sort of surface pressure with every stab that it would just take a whole lot more arm strength to get it in there. And it's a meditative but kind of lengthy process. So yeah, don't want to tire yourself out too quickly. But then again, if you're doing it just with 1 needle, it goes a whole lot slower. When we get to doing details on pieces, then I do switch to just 1 needle. You can be much more precise, but for the sort of bulk action, I like 3. So if you see, it's actually getting a lot smaller. It's much denser than it was when it was just that loose blob of yarn. And the parts that I stab most are going to compact in. So at this point, I'm going to start thinking about the shape that this object is going to be. I'm going to make it into another sort of decorative felted stone to add to my collection, but I want it to be a little bit more oblong. I notice for myself, I tend to go for round things. Trying to get myself out of that. I'm gonna felt it just a little bit more, just as yarn, and then I'm gonna go for adding in the roving. What I'm looking for as I turn it are any places that either feel not as dense or look slightly looser, like with little strings of yarn hanging off the side. Again, making really sure that I'm keeping the fingers of my other hand out of the way. I'm not going to worry too much about the shape at this point, because once I add the roving on, then I'm going to have to stab that in all over it too to get it to stick, and that'll change the shape a bunch also. I'm going to do that at this point. So something that is a bit counterintuitive when you're going for your roving, you never want to cut it. So if you take scissors and cut, what you're going to be doing is severing the fibers, and we want these really long fiber lengths. This is called Corriedale. It's from a particular kind of sheep, and it has this really nice sort of fuzzy, tacky texture that makes it really good for making structure. It's a little bit itchier for wearable things than, say, merino, but it's easier to use. So not using scissors, the way that I'm gonna separate some out is holding my hands maybe 5 inches apart and pull. And you can see all these nice fluffy loose ends coming out. That's what I want, is having this long fiber length, because that's the overlapping of the fibers is gonna give some good cohesive structure. I'm gonna pull off a couple of tufts for myself. If I try and pull with my hands too close together, I'm actually gripping opposite ends of the same fibers, and it's just never gonna separate. So remembering to have my hands kind of far apart. And this will be more pertinent with the wet felting, but I'm also very particular about the way that I hold it, and holding it kind of parallel to my forearm with my fingers, and then pulling down towards myself so that I get a nice, fluffy, all lined up clump. So got my clumps here. I'm gonna wrap it around my semi-felted yarn ball. It's gonna take a couple of layers to get this sort of seafoam green color of the yarn completely covered. So I'm gonna hold it in place. If I let go, it'll just spring off right now. But once I start felting it on, it's that same sort of mechanical process as when I started felting the yarn. The roving is getting pushed in to that yarn ball, and then little bits of the yarn fiber are getting pulled back out. So at this point, I could probably pull the roving back off of the yarn, but in just a minute, once I get it even more tacked on there, it's pretty much on there for good. So I like to sort of tack it down all the way around, and then I'm going to go and cover up the still visible parts of the yarn, and then get more into the shaping and surface smoothing. So as I'm going, at first the felted piece is going to start to have this sort of like pockmarked look, a little bit puckered where each needle has stabbed in. And it always kind of freaks me out at first, because I think like, oh my God, is it gonna look that way forever? And then every time I'm like, no, okay, just remind myself, it'll smooth out. It goes through just this sort of like pebbly stage. But then the more you felt it, the more smooth and even the surface becomes in this piece. If you're felting colors on top of the white, as we'll do in a minute, that can make your needle marks show up a bit more. But again, the more you continue to felt it, the more it'll even out that texture. So remembering to rotate as I go. This part still nice and fluffy looking because I have not felted it down at all. It's funny, I've had students say that this is like either very meditative and soothing, and then other people who use it to get out all their aggression. Like you're getting to stab something over and over. Personally, I find it fairly soothing. Another thing that may contribute to needles breaking, if you find that happening, is the angle that you're stabbing in. And these tools can be useful for that because they hold all your needles parallel. You want to make sure to just put the pressure straight on and then pull straight out. If you push in more at an angle or bend it before you pull it out, that's more likely to make your needle snap. I've also found really the thing that snaps needles the most is not having a nice squishy surface underneath, like the foam. If you're improvising with your squishy foam surfaces, you will find out very quickly. Oh, my mic is not doing it. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I can do anything with it. If you, oh, sorry, I forgot what I was saying. Yeah, hitting against a harder surface is going to break your needles more. Okay, so I've got this layer pretty much on, and I'm going to cover up these green visible spots on the top and bottom. So again, holding the roving over the piece while I start to tack it down. And then I would continue doing that, but jumping ahead, one that is a little bit farther in the process. I've started on a little portrait of my dog. So this is going to be her head. And making a little ear that goes on here. So to make the ear, when you're sculpting a more complex shape, you want to make your pieces individually first and then attach them together. So to make the ear, I needle felted it straight on the foam. So I'm going to do the other one here to show you what that looks like. So I've got 2 chunks of roving. I'm going to lay them over each other crosswise, wrap one around the other. And the reason to do the crosswise overlap is I'm already thinking about starting that tangling up of the fibers process. So doing a nice little packet here. You can see it's a lot bigger than the other ear, but in just a second, it's going to start compacting down. So stabbing straight into the foam and tucking in the edges, starting to shape it into that sort of triangle shape of the peppy ear.
Hannah, how do you shape something into a specific form?
For a flat piece like these ears, I want to think about sort of tucking and folding over the edges here. So bringing up that corner and then tacking it in with a few stabs. For shaping this one, which started out oblong into this more snout shape, I felted the narrower part of the snout a lot more. Wherever you felt more is going to compact it more. So that'll make it both smaller in volume and also more dense. So in terms of squishability, the top of the head, so I can squeeze it in about half of its volume. The snout, only about a quarter. So this part is much more dense. So where you felt is gonna kind of tuck it in, the same way as when you're adding the roving in over your yarn ball in the initial phase, it kind of tucks the roving into your piece there. It's just that on a more compacted scale. So it kind of sticks into my foam a little bit. You can see all those needle holes that I made. I'm gonna rotate so I can get the other side. And flip it over. This side is still very soft and fluffy looking.
I have a quick question for you about your use of yarn in the
Yeah.
middle. Does it have to be a wool yarn as well?
No, the stuff that I'm using is, I believe, cotton. Most yarns that I've tried work well. The fuzzier they are, the better they'll work. So if you have something like really kind of silky, it probably won't work as well.
Okay.
But you can, probably whatever yarn you have on hand will work. For the roving part, people traditionally use sheep's wool because it has really good sort of self-adhesive properties. I've had a student felt her cat's hair. My dad was a hippie in the 70s who felted his dog's hair. You can felt your own hair. Curly hair works better. Yeah, basically any animal hair or a lot of synthetic fibers will work. Okay, so now I'm going to attach on, let's see, the edges aren't actually that great, but tack them in a little more. I'm going to attach on. The attaching process is just felting one piece to the other. So I'm going to position where the ear goes, and that's what it looks like from the back. And then rather than having to glue or sew it, I can just felt it right on there. And the more that I felt it, the sturdier this attachment will be. And when I'm done with the attachment, I'm going to give it a little piece of roving right over here to cover up any evidence of a seam in between. My dog has giant ears, so this feels appropriate. Now is when I want a little bit more precision, so I'm going to go to my one needle at a time. That's one on. And then I'm going to do the other one over here. Same process, kind of holding in place. When you're attaching together different pieces, if you get them on there and realize, oh no, they're not in the right place, you can usually just kind of pull it back off again, unless you've really thoroughly felted it. But it's a forgiving process. Then as I, on my own, continue with this piece, I'm going to shape it a little bit more. She usually has one ear that's floppy, so I would tack it down here. And then to shape the facial features, it's a similar but more precise process as what I did to shape the snout. So like when I'm going around her nose, I would take a little bit of black roving, pull some off, bundle it up into a nose shape, felt it on. Once I get it attached, I'm going to really clean up these edges by pulling in those black fibers and felting them into the middle of the black spot there, so that it has nice clean edges. And this is, again, when you want to be using one needle. And then to make the slight indent of the mouth, I just start felting along that line. And the more I do it, the more it's gonna pucker in all along there. And she has some brown spots too and some little freckles. So I would take those colors of roving. An example of what some of that detail already done looks like is the little owl here. So like to make the brown line, I use just a very thin piece of roving and kind of twisted it up a little bit into a sort of loose yarn. Place it where you want it to be, and then felt that in. And then if you want to add in little wire appendages, you make those, stick them in, put a little bit of roving around their attachment point, and carefully felt in. And I'm doing it at an angle, so I'm not going perpendicular to the wire, because again, if I go perpendicular, I risk breaking my needle. So that's a quick rundown of sculptural felting. We can also use needle felting to do some decoration on some wet felted pieces. Before I go into that, does anyone have any questions about the sculptural process? Nope, cool, okay. So this is a piece that I wet felted previously, then let it dry. You don't want to be needle felting onto something that's still wet. But you can needle felt on to give it all this sort of decorative pattern. So all the color that you see on here is needle felted on. You can add color in the wet felting process, but it's not going to be quite as precise. So what this would be like is similar to the way that I did the owl face decoration. So finding a little piece of roving, remembering to hold my hands a few inches apart as I pull and separate the fibers. And then I want to go for some sort of like tufty looking things here. And then I'm going to do some precise lines also. Just dabbing it on in. Make sure you're on your foam base and not on your table.
Anna, can you describe, sorry, can you briefly describe the wet felting process? How did you come up with the base, the piece that you felted onto?
Yeah, so wet felting achieves ultimately the same goal as needle felting, just very different feel to it. So we don't need the foam or the needles for that. Let me get that out of the way. So the materials that we want for wet felting are bubble wrap. I prefer the small bubbles. You can use big bubbles if that's all you have on hand. If you don't have any bubbles, you can just use a garbage bag. And then you want some window screen. So this is a fairly fine mesh. Don't remember the exact number, but you definitely want the flexible stuff, not the metal stuff. That will tear up your hands like crazy. And I've got a pretty big piece of screen here. So it's maybe about 3 feet by 2 feet, more or less. Because the window screen is going to go both under and over the piece that I'm felting. So I get it all laid out on my table. And then soapy water is the key to the adhesive process and why it's called wet felting. You can use a spray bottle. I just save these plastic bottles and do about half and half soap and water. Use whatever kind you want. Preferably something that doesn't dry your hands out like crazy. And to make it into a squirt bottle, you take your cap, poke a bunch of holes in there, and then make sure you remember you have the cap with holes on it so you don't spill soapy water everywhere. And then the next step is to lay out the roving. So if you remember a minute ago when I was talking about separating the roving, you want to hold it with your fingers against your palm so you get a very even grip and pull. And we're going to do 3 layers. And this part always seems like a little nitpicky, but the more evenly you lay out your roving, the more even your piece is going to be. So if you have some spots where it's really thick and then some spots where it's thinner, you're going to have that same density variation in your final piece, which can also be a cool effect that you may want to go for. But if you're doing like a wearable thing, you probably want it a little bit more even. So here's one layer, and then the next layer I'm going to do perpendicular. So rather than horizontal like this one, it's going to go vertical. It's important to remember that alternating of the directions of your layers. It will help with the structural integrity of your finished piece. If you pull off too thick a chunk, you can always separate it into 2. And that one was a little thin, so I'm going to give another one on top. And if you can see here, so the first chunk ends about here, but they get a little sparse at the end rather than kind of a sudden stop. So I'm going to overlap the sparse end of the next one on that sparse end of the previous layer. So that's layer 2. And then layer 3, I'm going to go back in the same direction as layer 1.
Do you typically want 3 layers, or can you make it more than that or less than that?
I wouldn't go less, but you can do more. The thicker it is, the longer it will take, but the sturdier your piece will be. The reason I wouldn't go less is I think it just risks not having quite enough density and overlap. The overlap of the alternating direction layers really helps with the sort of structural integrity of your piece. Okay, so I've got my white base layer here. I'm gonna grab one of my samples. I can show you what it looks like when you wet felt colors onto it. So this piece, all these colors were wet felted on, and it makes this more sort of flowy pattern as compared to the needle felting, which is a lot more precise. And then this one here, I intentionally made all these holes in it. And that can happen unintentionally if you have some really thin spots, but it can be a cool sort of like spider webby decaying effect if you're into that. And all the color on this one is also wet felted on.
So when you wet felt on, that's basically adding color to this base and then doing the wet process?
Exactly, that's what I'm about to do right now. So I'm gonna take some of my colored roving and layer it over. Something to keep in mind with wet felting is that the unfelted roving, the stuff still, will only felt onto other unfelted roving. So if I tried to lay out everything here on top of this piece and felt it, it wouldn't stick. When I'm finished, I would have this piece and then this piece on top of it. So if you have some pieces that you've already felted, and you want to attach them, really the only way to do that with felting process is by needle felting. And the felting starts pretty quickly, so it's good to keep your pre-planning brain turned on if you want to add color or pattern, so that you don't, start felting and then realize, oh my God, I forgot the turquoise. And I always like to keep in mind too that you can combine the needle felting and wet felting. So having some of your pattern be with the more fluid look of the wet felting, and then you can do really crisp needle felted lines on top. Let's get just a blob of purple up here. Okay. So once you've got your whole piece laid out, you're going to take your window screen. If you have a large piece of window screen like I do, you can just fold it straight over. If you have smaller pieces, just do one on top of the other. You want to make sure there's no lumps in it, so smoothing it down. And this is both a kind of messy and clean process. It's messy in that you get soapy water everywhere, but it's just soap. Then you take your squirt bottle, shake it up if your soap is settled, and squirt down your piece. And I really want it to be fully saturated, so squirt some soapy water on there, push it down, and it's getting less fluffy, but it's still pretty fluffy in there. I don't want to feel any of that fluffiness. I'm going to squirt more just on those fluffy spots. And around the edges a bit. That feels pretty good. I may add more as I'm going. Then I'm going to rub. And there's a lot of rubbing your piece. When I do felting, a lot of wet felting in a day, I will wear gloves, otherwise get these like crazy scaly dry hands. But if I'm not doing that much, I prefer the sort of textural detail feeling of not having gloves on. So I'm rubbing in circles, rubbing back and forth, and I'm gonna keep my piece in between the window screen for kind of a while. What the window screen is doing for me is holding all that roving in place. If I were to just get my piece wet and start felting without the screen, I would just completely disrupt all the roving, make a bunch of holes, mess up whatever pattern or picture that I did with the color of roving on top. So the window screen is kind of a protector. And I'm not sure how well you can see on the video here, but there's some little bits of roving that are coming through the screen. Totally fine, just pick them off. When you felt wet felting, similar with needle felting, your piece is going to shrink. What you're doing to the roving is compacting it and making it a lot more dense, because it starts out as this like super fluffy, soft material, so that means there's a lot of air in it. But I'm making what is going to feel like, you know, a piece of fabric, more or less. So it's a lot less airy. So it's going to be getting smaller, both in thickness, squishing down, and also in its outer dimensions, which is something to keep in mind if you're making like a hat or arm warmers or something. You want to measure about maybe 10% bigger than you want your final piece to be. Rub one side, and then I'm going to flip it over. And this is why you need the screen on the other side as well. So you can flip your whole piece. And rubbing the other side. Some people also use a thing that looks kind of like an old-fashioned washboard. It has all these ridges on it, and you can take your whole piece in window screen and kind of scrub it back and forth over the washboard. That does go a little bit faster. Personally, I'm very much a process person, and I like to be able to feel under my fingertips the whole thing as it's happening, so I prefer just by hand. I find you can be slightly more precise that way also. If you don't have any liquid soap on hand, a workaround, if you have a bar of soap, just get your piece wet, take your soap bar and rub with the bar of soap until it gets nice and sudsy, and then you can go to using your hands. If you're doing this in winter, you can also use warm water, and that makes it go a little bit faster. Once you rub it up on both sides, then you get to test if it's felted enough to take the screen off. So you'll notice I'm doing it very slowly. I'm not just ripping that screen back because the roving has gotten a little bit in to the screen, which is normal. But as I'm peeling the screen back, I want to make sure to hold that roving down. Pulling that off there, roll it up so it's out of the way. And now I'm going to gently, with much less pressure than I was doing through the screen, keep rubbing. And this feels felted enough to rub without the screen. And the reason I know that is there aren't too many chunks that are moving around. If there were a lot of chunks of roving separating from the main body of the piece, that would tell me that it's not felted enough and I need the screen as that sort of seal on top to keep it all held together. I'm going to do a little more here. And remember how I was talking about shrinkage? The direction of your rub is the direction it's going to shrink. So if I rub this way, it's going to shrink in this way. If I rub this way, it's going to shrink in this way. So if you want a particular shape, that's something to keep in mind. And the more you rub a specific spot, the more that spot is going to shrink. I'm going to try and peel it off the other side. So again, going very slowly, feeling for any attached fibers, especially on the side where I've put on my colored roving, so I don't want to inadvertently rip that pattern off if it's not yet felted enough. And by enough, in terms of timing, if you're a vigorous rubber, it's probably maybe 5 to 10 minutes on each side. Probably more like 5. If you're just having a nice, slow massage there, you probably want to give it a little more time. There's not really any harm to felting it more through the screen. So don't be too worried about doing that too much. All right, so there's front of my piece. And keep rubbing it flat for another minute here. And then I can actually pick it up and rub it between my hands and be even more precise about how I'm sort of editing the shape that way. So you see how the edges are kind of getting tucked in a little bit more from me rubbing on them. Do more sort of circles in the middle. Probably could have gone a little longer with the screen here. This part is coming off a little bit, but when I'm finished, I'll just needle felt that down and that'll tack it into place. Then holding it underneath with one hand and rubbing between my palms. It's a very satisfyingly sensory process. I really enjoy that aspect. And the way that you tell if your piece is done is first understanding that there's a big spectrum that could all count as done. It kind of depends on if you're making like a wall hanging or something wearable. But the more you felt it, the denser it will be. For a wearable thing, you probably want it pretty dense. And you can test that by holding it up sideways. Take a little pinch on one side in one hand, pinch on the other side in the other hand, give it a tug. And here, if I do it close to the edge, you can probably see better. So the fibers are kind of pulling out a little bit. So that tells me it's not very dense in the middle. It's still pretty loose, which I know because I haven't been felting it that long. But as you're familiarizing yourself with the process and you've been working on one piece for a bit longer, it's always good to test. Once you cannot pull apart the two sides at all, then it's pretty much as felted as it's going to get. Yeah, you keep on rubbing until it is fully dense. But just with the last few minutes here, I want to show you all the layout for making a hollow thing. But all there is left to finish on this one is, well, maybe another hour of rubbing. But you get the picture. So wet felting, you can make hollow three-dimensional things. I've been working on some little baby hats. So all the color on these was wet felted on. And what you use for that process is called a resist. And that is just a template made of plastic. So this is a couple layers of thick plastic garbage bag. If you have like a plastic drop cloth, that works too. Basically, you just want it to be as stiff plastic as possible. Your basic shopping bag is not really going to cut it. And you want to lay out your roving same as we did before, except I'm going to overlap by about 1.5 inches all the way around this top arch. This is going to be the bottom of the hat, the flat side near me. And because I don't want to felt the bottom closed, I am going to leave a gap there. So I'm making it pretty thick because some of my previous hats, I think, would not actually keep people that warm. You can see I've got these gaps in the middle, so covering them up. So that's first layer. Second layer, remembering to go perpendicular to the first layer in terms of the direction of the roving. I had somebody recently ask me if you have to use sheep's wool because it's citrus allergic. You do not. If you look, particularly on Etsy, I've found actually has a lot of roving vendors. There's like some alpaca wool, or you can get like mohair, which that's a goat, I believe. So don't worry about that if that's an issue for you. Or you could always wear gloves if your allergy is not too extreme. So second layer, and then just in the interest of time, pretend I did the third layer. And I'm going to Cover it up with my window screen. Give it a quick squirt. Pat it down. Not felting at all, so no rubbing yet. Just want to get it wet so it gets dense enough that I can pick up my whole screen sandwich here. Flip it on over. Uncover my other side. Make sure that I'm holding that fringe of roving down as I do. And then I'm going to fold the roving around my template here. So this is what's going to start to make it a 3D situation, or a future 3D situation. And then I'm going to do a layer up on the other side, making sure to overlap with this roving here that I just folded around. And once I get this part on, then I will squirt this side down and start felting by rubbing, same as I just did with that other piece. And I'm going to felt it more through the screen than last time. And then when I take off the screen, I'm going to keep on rubbing it for a while with that plastic in the center. And then once it feels pretty densely felted, I'm going to pull the plastic out, put one hand on the inside, one hand on the outside, and keep on felting, making sure to rotate as I go so that I can really round out the shape. And the template that I used inside here made this hat. So that gives you some idea of the shrinkage. Some of that shrinkage initially is going to come from it just getting wetted down, but then a lot also from it felting. It did tuck under the band. So I guess that's more the size of it. But I don't know what that is, maybe about 15%. But again, remember the shrinkage is something you can kind of play with by felting more in one area than another. And then one more thing just to show you all some samples is what it looks like when you incorporate some other materials. So you can felt onto fabric. This is some just sort of gauzy stuff. I needle felted right on. It kind of changes the texture. It puckers in a little bit where I stabbed it with the needle. So that will depend on the fabric and I guess sort of thread count that you're using. But if you have a sweater that is a little plain for your taste, you can felt on it, for example. Or this piece was a felted background. And then I attached some lace to the front by needle felting this sort of, it's very light periwinkle roving over it, and then some yarn. This was a combo of gray and white, wet felted, with some needle felting on top, some little beads stuck in there, and then some of that same sort of gauzy fabric that is tucked in underneath this orange roving, and then needle felted through onto the white. You can see what the back looks like. You can see where the colored roving from the front kind of got pushed through. So these do have a sort of clear front and back, if that's a consideration for you. And some more beading. Cool thing with needle felting is you can think of it just like sort of gluing stuff down. You can always tack something down with a little bit of roving. So it gives you a lot of pattern options.
Did you felt the beads with the needle as well, or are they attached in a different way?
So on this piece, I strung them on a little bit of wire. If you can see it right in there. and then it's attached with all these orange lines, and then over here, that go over the wire that I looped around, and then over the beads. So the beads are, the hole in the beads is parallel to the piece of felt. On this piece, rather than stringing on wire, I took a little bit of roving, twisted it up to make a pointy end, and then threaded the bead onto that pointy end, and then needle felted the roving on. Which I like because it gives it this sort of like hourglass thing where it's like the bead is holding it in a little bit more. It can be nice and decorative that way.
Beautiful. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. We are right at 7:30. I'm just going to give folks another chance for any kind of questions that they have before we take off.
I have a question. This is Mausi. As far as beads, can you wet felt the beads on like a strip of rope with the roving and then wet felt it onto a piece of felt of?
If you have it sandwiched enough between roving, you could, but I suspect that you would end up just kind of covering up your bead and with roving.
But I mean, if you put it on like a strip of roving like you did there and wet felted it, you know, like like you thread the beads onto a piece of roving.
I see what you're saying. You know, I haven't actually tried, but thinking through the theory of it, I think that could work. Yeah. You would want to
because it would hold the beads in place just where the other strip of roving is, and the beads probably stand out. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, just keep in mind with that you can't felt raw roving onto an already felted piece.
Right.
But if you have the beginning of your piece that you're wet felting and you string your beads onto some roving and then put it down in wet felt, I think it should work. Again, if it doesn't stick super well, you can always needle felt it on for a little extra adhesion. But yeah, try it. Let me know how it goes. I haven't actually tried that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hannah, any recommendations for where to buy wool? Any vendors that you would recommend?
When I'm going for the large amounts of white or gray roving, I just searched through Etsy. There was somebody in Ohio, I forget the name of the vendor, who had really nice roving from her own sheep. Fortunately, she's not selling it anymore. Just ordered some from somebody in Washington State. If you search for wool roving on Etsy, you can find like more options than you'll know what to do with. For the colored roving, like comes in these little, oftentimes in Ziplocs or in these sort of rolls. You can get that so many places. Amazon has like a zillion options. A lot of craft stores carry it too. You can also find it on Etsy. I got I think 50 pack of 50 different colors like 5 years ago, and I'm still working through it. So depending on how into particular colors you are, that'll last you varying amounts of time. I haven't had as much luck finding bulk roving on Amazon for reasonable prices, but you know, the supplies are changing all the time.
Is everybody from Pennsylvania that's on here? Because out in Lancaster, there's a couple of farms that actually sell them.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
And I'll be happy to share that. I don't know how I do that, but I'll be happy to share it.
Yeah, if you can put the names of the farms into the chat, or I'm going to put my email in there and I can email everybody that information if you email it to me. Oop, that just went to Hannah. Any words of wisdom if you're working on large scale? You're working on something that's wall mounted or more wearable?
the main word would just be patience. It's a slow process. But yeah, so if you're working on a piece that's more than a couple feet at a time, what I like to do is actually felt it by section. So if you remember when I was showing you how to do the back side of the hat with the folding over of the roving, so what you want to do when you're working in sections is leave the last 4 or 5 inches, about a hand length, more or less, unfelted roving. Try and keep it dry if you can. If not, just don't rub that part. And then you felt the whole section. So like say I'm felting this, and then I have some loose roving hanging off over here. Once this whole part is felted, I will move it out of my felting zone, layer on some more roving onto overlapping with the unfelted roving part. Do that section, leaving a fringe of unfelted roving and so on, so that you can make a bigger piece without having to have a super huge table or workspace. Really, it's just keeping in mind that principle that you can only wet felt onto unfelted roving. So you got to leave that fringe that you can get a good couple inches of overlap. If you have a huge workspace, you could just lay out the whole thing at once. Something nice about felting also is it's not really time-based in the same way that, say, like ceramics is. You don't have to worry about keeping it wet. So if you're wet felting something for a little while and your studio time is up, you can wrap it up, stick it in the fridge if it's summertime, come back to it later, wet it back down, or you can even just let it dry out and then give it another squirt of soapy water when you're ready to work on it again. It's not like the fibers will be disturbed by drying out and getting wet again.
Great. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really fun, and I learned so much. I've never felted, but it looks very pleasurable.
It's very, very sensory. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And I love talking process and technique. So feel free to email me if you have any questions about it.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight. Join us on Thursday for a figure drawing presentation by Bernard Collins. Otherwise, have a great evening. Stay safe, and good night. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Anna. Good night.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.